Everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us for today's session. This is the 2026 Compliance Lookahead. It's the implications for surveillance leadership. My name is Shiloh Thomas. I'm from the Product and Solutions Marketing team for Arctera, and I will be your host for today. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. All lines will be muted, so feel free to listen comfortably. If you have any questions, you can submit those anytime using the Q&A panel. We will be running a few short polls during the session to make this interactive, so we do encourage you to participate. And finally, a recording of today's webinar will be sent to all registrants and will also be available on arctera.com. So just a quick introduction to our panel. So a quick introduction to our panel. Joining me here today, we've got Anna Grime, a senior analyst at Opimas. She is the lead author of the Financial Services Regulatory Outlook 2025 through 2027 report. Anna studies global regulatory trends, technology strategy, and the evolving shape of compliance teams across financial services institutions. And second, we have Chris Stapenhurst. He is a product manager here at Arctera for surveillance. Chris works directly with institutions across financial services, and he helps operationalize surveillance programs, helps our customers deploy AI responsibly, and helps them navigate privacy and sovereignty requirements. Anna, Chris, thank you both for being here today.
Thanks, Shiloh.
So before we get started
today, thank you.
Before we get started, I do want to just share the roadmap for the next 45 minutes or so. We'll walk through some of the pressures that compliance leaders are facing here today that are keeping them up at night. We'll talk a little bit about how rules and tools are changing the game and where financial institutions can get ahead, not just simply keep up. And finally, what does leadership look like in 2026 and beyond? And we'll have a conversation between Anna and Chris about that. Finally, we'll wrap, if we have time, with Q&A and share a link to the full report so you can get access to the findings in more depth. And as we progress forward, let me just introduce really quick, if you're not familiar with who Arctera is, we are a global provider of compliance and governance solutions. We serve thousands of customers worldwide, including 70% of the Fortune 100. Now, in financial institutions, we support surveillance, communications oversight, and AI-driven review across regions. But today isn't about product. It's about the forces reshaping compliance. But I think just having that context helps frame why we're hosting the conversation. So without further ado, let me go ahead and jump right in. Let's begin with the reality that many compliance and surveillance teams are living right now. First, regulations, they are not slowing down. They're splintering. In fact, long-standing hope of having a harmonized global standard has given way to region-specific mandates and diverging enforcement philosophies. Second, privacy, AI oversight, and regional requirements, they are stretching all of the teams thin. Compliance leaders, they're navigating more jurisdictions than ever, more scrutiny, and more questions about how technology is and should be used. And finally, budgets, as we all know, they aren't keeping pace. Expectations are continuing to rise, but unfortunately, resources don't always follow suit. And that's the pressure, the environment that teams are operating within today. So Anna, based on your research, what is driving the most strain for compliance and surveillance teams right now?
Well, I think the core fear never really changes. It's sort of the thing that makes you wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat is definitely always the fear that you've missed something material, that your team has some kind of a misconduct pattern that harmed clients, damaged the balance sheet, hurt one of your counterparties, or cause some serious reputational damage. Regardless of what happens with regulations, new technology, any kind of geopolitical shift, I think that remains the core fear. But the psychological burden of that role of being in compliance or in surveillance, the sort of risk of the unseen failure, that's just a constant companion. It reminds me a little bit of the type of person who chooses to work in compliance, reminds me a bit of the type of person who might choose to be the goalkeeper on a soccer team. We even wear a different color jersey, and you do have to live with a certain psychological weight. But in terms of more current stressors that surveillance teams are facing, there are definitely a few. One of the most consistent pieces of feedback I received was some persistent trauma, I'd say, from the last enforcement wave, mostly coming out of the US. Between 2021 and 2023, US regulators imposed more than $2 billion in record-keeping related fines. You can actually see that on one of our charts if you want to pull it up, looking at SEC fines by enforcement wave. The individual firms faced penalties in the $100 to $200 million range in those years. And that definitely scared everyone straight. And you had many insisting upon buying new surveillance systems or improving their approaches pretty dramatically. Boards definitely viewed surveillance gaps as an enterprise risk. Record keeping is absolutely not seen as a back office sort of function, but an existential one, especially when you had fines of that magnitude. The magnitude of fines has gone down, but many firms were still in, it's actually the one with SEC in the title. Yeah, exactly. That's the one, exactly. So you can see the severity of fines over the course of these regulatory waves went down, but the number of firms in the crosshairs remained fairly constant, always sort of 11 to 16 at a time. And part of the reason that the magnitude of these fines has gone down is that many firms took themselves to the regulator and said, look, we have identified these shortcomings, and this is what we're doing to address them. But that remains the number one fear, I'd say. I have two more fears, though. Number two is that firms very much feel the pressure that expectations are rising faster than their budgets. With AI on everyone's mind and what you think can be achieved with improved technological capabilities, there very much is the expectation that you're going to be able to produce better results with your surveillance programs and record-keeping programs than you have been. But total budgets are not quite increasing. Technology budgets are still moderately growing, which you actually can still see in one of these charts as well, if you'd like to share. In fact, as an industry, we think there's quite a bit of money being spent on technology for surveillance and record keeping. But overall budgets for compliance teams is staying very tight. That's tough because data volumes are continuing to expand. The number of communication channels is constantly expanding. And yeah, AI is on everyone's mind. So that has expectations rising. And my last thought in terms of what's really keeping everybody up at night is that regulators have really moved from saying, why are you using AI, when it was still a bit of a black box, to why aren't you using AI yet? Now everyone's thinking about how to make use of some of these new technologies. So it's AI is both a tool and then also a bit of a risk, and that's a balance that compliance teams have to contend with.
And Chris, from your conversations with financial services institutions, where do you see teams feeling this pressure? I'm sure it's every day. Can you share a little bit about the conversations you've been having? You're on mute as well. We keep forgetting the mute button.
So I've definitely been having a lot of conversations around AI. I think Anna, you said it perfectly. Like it's the expectation now is that AI is being used. Um, I've attended a lot of conferences over the last few years as well, regulator-led conferences, industry peer-led conferences. And while AI is the expectation, I think there's still a broad consensus that it continues to remain sort of human in the loop type of AI, right? They're not looking to replace the actual surveillance of communications entirely by the AI. They're still expecting humans to be involved. And I think that's a reasonable expectation to carry through with us, at least through the next near to medium term. And so I don't see that going away. I think the challenge becomes for compliance executives and compliance teams in general, there's an expectation by the board, by the C-level team, that different organizations, different silos within their firm, including compliance, is demonstrating the use of AI to increase efficiencies, right? Is that AI that you're implementing, is it measurable? Is it demonstrable? How do you demonstrate that you're achieving more with the AI? And I think that's another challenge, right? That you, Anna said it really well earlier that, regulators are asking why not AI? So you've got that coming at you from one side. And then you've got your executives and board members asking you, what have you done with AI? How are you investing in AI to improve the efficiency of your department, right? And so you've got both of these challenges. And so how do you solve them, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that during this session, I'm sure. Anna's got some great points on this too. I can give you a real world example just to kind of get us started. And that is a firm I've been working with here in the UK. And so uh, they basically needed to find a way to not only implement AI for the reasons mentioned before, but also from a day-to-day perspective, deal better with the surveillance of audio and video content, right? They were listening to entire phone calls and entire meetings. And so that was wrapping up, a number of FTEs every day, which is not very efficient given the advances we've seen in transcription, translation, and the ability to draw out alerts based on the content within these communications. And so we implemented a transcription-based VCOM program within that firm, and they were able to go from two full-time headcount reviewing full conversations and full phone calls to one guy maybe spending an hour only listening to the parts of the conversation that were relevant from an alert perspective and digging deeper, obviously, when they had to. That was both measurable and demonstrable to the chief executive officer, who was able to turn to the board and say, hey, look, I've got a success story with AI. We were able to save money. And at the same time, also helps address the regulator questions as to why are you not using AI? So that's one example that I hold near and dear to my heart, and I hope to replicate with as many of my fellow customers as possible.
So let's move to a poll. We'd love to hear from you in terms of the pressures that you're facing. Which pressure is hitting your team the hardest? And while we give a little time to answer the poll, I did have a couple of follow-up questions, Chris, Anna, for you in terms of the risk that teams are focusing on. If they're focusing on the most visible pressure, like off-channel communication example, are they missing some of the more serious gaps? Like, how do you balance your focus and make sure that you're not missing something?
I would say they definitely have a lot on their plate. They have to do it all. And if you don't, you have to have a very good reason that you can stand behind. And it's not just with the in the UK, there's the SMCR, the senior managers regime, where you have an individual responsible for compliance standing behind it. It's not just sort of the firm. Yeah, you have a lot going on. You really are the goalie.
Yeah, I agree. I think as well, right? Uh, as a compliance leader within your firm, you better understand where your risk is, right? Is off channel one of the bigger risks in your firm? Do you need to be moving more of your pieces to help address that particular risk? Or is it some other risk, right? You need to spread out your resources to ensure that the biggest challenges that your firm is facing, and it could be very different than the challenges another firm is facing, that you've got the right chess pieces on the board attacking that risk effectively, right? And so you need to have a good understanding of the exposure you have when it comes to the regulations. And I think that's critical.
And in looking at some of the poll responses, Chris, you had mentioned the chess pieces, and certainly one of those is being able to have the right reconciliation, auditing, reporting behind it too, right?
Yeah.
A vast majority of our respondents did mention that as something that really challenges them.
Oh yeah. A couple of years ago when this started coming out, right? This is related to the off-channel risk. Um, a lot of firms were almost angry, right? Regulators were asking more and more questions, deeper and deeper questions, and asking them to provide evidence, reconciliation at a level that wasn't seen before. And I think firms have started to come to grips that this is no longer something that they can just kind of rely on. It's something that needs to be tested, something that needs to be validated very carefully, because this is definitely a continued area of concern by the regulators themselves. Are you capturing all the content? Um, is it coming through correctly? Is it actually being surveilled? These are very difficult questions to answer when you're managing an entire team, looking at different channels and different data types. Even on the trade side, this is an issue.
And that's a really great segue to our next section here. Now that we've grounded ourselves in the pressures that teams are feeling, I want to talk a little bit about the landscape because it is shifting right underneath our feet. When we think about the story, it's not just the strain, and we talked a little bit about that, but the underlying compliance model has changed. The era of global harmonization, as we talked about, is over. Data sovereignty is certainly reshaping infrastructure decisions, and regulators are no longer debating whether AI should work. They're actually saying, are you using it and how is it being governed? And so, Anna, back to you. Where are you seeing the biggest regulatory shifts today? And why do they matter for global surveillance programs?
I find it quite interesting because I remember a few short years ago, everyone was talking about the goal of harmonized regulatory requirements globally. And maybe it reflects a bit of the geopolitical climate, who knows exactly, but there have been a plethora of jurisdictions putting out their own rules regarding data sovereignty, privacy rules, hosting requirements. And that's something that compliance teams in especially global firms need to mind, because if suddenly sanctions are imposed here or there, or your own, wherever you're located, has a problem with a server being in one country or another, you will have to have infrastructure that's able to export the data that you need without damaging it. And you'll have to be quite flexible with your architecture. So I would see that fragmentation on the regulatory landscape globally as probably a reflection of a bit of a political mood globally. And there's no question that adds complexity and cost for compliance teams. The other thing is that I would say they're really quite different sort of regulatory temperaments from one nation to another. In the US, you see by far the most sort of punitive and high penalty activity from regulators, and from the regulators. And that's a bit in contrast to in Europe and in Asia, where the magnitude of fines is just far lower. And there's been a much greater emphasis on remediation and sending stern letters. And part of the reason for this is likely that in the US, there's perhaps a bit more certainty that the industry is very strong there. And in other countries, maybe in the UK, the FCA might be a bit more cautious about losing business to a more friendly jurisdiction in the EU. Maybe there's a greater chance to move, something like that. The other subject that's on a lot of people's minds on the regulatory front is crypto, because we've seen enormous penalties there, as you can see in this chart, actually, in this sort of teal color. That chunk of money was fines that were given to crypto firms. You think of FTX and Binance in recent years. And it's very clear that regulators do not think of crypto as somehow experimental territory. It's not being ignored, and surveillance and compliance expectations are very high here as well.
Yeah, as they should be, Anna.
Yeah.
I agree. The firms need to maybe handle a little bit how they address compliance. And that's definitely my point of view. I really thought what you said around privacy is really interesting. Again, I attend conferences on, every major geography here, right? In America, in Europe, in APJ as well. And the perspective is really interesting and incredibly diverse, right? This is an area where there's not a lot of consensus, right? So my take on the whole, regulations versus privacy debate, I'm not alone, but there is no majority. Let's be clear here. Is that, regulations trump privacy. However, that's just a high level position. When we look at different firms, the reality is actually much more nuanced, right? Are you capturing content of non-monitored employees? How does that fall in scope of things like privacy, right? And how do you ensure that the proper protections are done on all of your data? And what I've seen implemented in the world by various different financials is different regimes, right? We've got some firms, European based, putting everything into a single data center, regardless of where they are, right? We've got others that feel the need to stand up different data centers, some on clouds, some on-prem, and deal with residency requirements that way. I think essentially it all comes down not so much to the regulation itself or the privacy rule itself, because when you look at the details of either, there is some flexibility there. I think ultimately it comes down to how does the firm answer this one question? And that is basically, how are we going to defend our position, right? If we go all in one data center or if we go spread out, how do we defend it? And more importantly than that, if you're working on the compliance team or in the surveillance team, who within your firm is actually answering that question? If it's not from your team, if it's someone else, how are they answering that question? And what lens are they interpreting when they answer that question? Are they taking into account the impact that it might have on communication surveillance, on trade surveillance, and on other different aspects of compliance? So I think those two key questions need to be answered for you to properly come to terms with how your firm is going to address that whole regulation versus privacy debate. Me personally, and feel free to disagree with me, I still believe that regulations trump privacy at the high level, and that should be the guiding light. But I'm fine if you disagree with me on that one.
I think your view would be an easier one for the industry, and I would welcome it as well, I must say.
Thanks, Anna. And I know it's complex. This is not something that can be solved easily.
Indeed.
I'd like to say a healthy debate. Really interesting topic when we think about what the different regimes mean and the impact operationally and on infrastructure and control happen to be. So let's move to our next poll question. And as we do that, let's answer the question of which shift is having the biggest impact on your planning. And Chris, I know you had mentioned about impact. I do want to go back though to that that conversation of the question that we should be asking ourselves, and more importantly, around the debate of on-prem versus SaaS. If a SaaS, and this is probably for you, Chris, if a SaaS platform meets regional certifications, right? The sovereignty, security requirements that are involved with that, does the hybrid debate become less relevant, less about infrastructure and more about control?
That's a nuanced question, so I don't think there's a straightforward answer. If you want to go cloud only, can you defend use of a single cloud, or do you need different clouds in your environment to handle different jurisdictions, right? And if that is insufficient, let's say you're uncomfortable with public cloud in China, in that situation there, you may want on-prem deployment, right? So I really don't think there's a straightforward response to this question, unfortunately. So,
Well,
But
one
I
of
think
the, oh, go ahead. Sorry, Anna.
I would just say that to a lot of the questions in compliance will have the same nuanced, maybe frustrating answer, which is if you feel you can defend it. But each approach needs to be thoroughly considered, and then you have to make sure the tech can meet your needs, of course.
One of the top responses from the poll was about AI and how that is having an impact. And of course, part of that would be defensibility. Can you explain how AI is being used and the outcomes that it's delivering? Um, if regulators are expecting that we use some of it, if they're saying, why aren't you using AI? What would make a regulator uncomfortable with AI deployments today? Do we have a level of understanding? How can we guide these type of implementations and make them regulator proof, if you will? Any takers there?
Well,
sure. Oh, go ahead, Anna.
I'll just say something really, really quickly. What I came up with a lot in my conversations with surveillance people responsible for their surveillance programs is a real concern about not just the sort of AI black box, which the regulators nobody's comfortable with, but also if you let it run without careful human monitoring, the plausible but wrong results that are produced, and that is just still very much a rampant problem. So you can use some of these tools, but with a big brother arm over the shoulder, very much guided by a human.
Yeah, I think human in the loop definitely remains the consensus. I think the other bit is that you don't want to be, and I'm quoting someone here, Gary Gensler, the ex-chair of the SEC. He said this at a FINRA conference, and it stuck with me. It's just something I really believe in wholeheartedly, is that you don't want to be putting all of your eggs in the AI basket. In fact, you don't want to be putting all of your eggs in any basket. When it comes to detection, you need to ensure that you've got a layered approach, right? I used to be, when I first joined here, the firm, we were called Symantec. We were a security firm. And and even though, I specialize in this sector, I did learn a lot about security. And one of the really interesting analogies I make to the security landscape is the concept of security as an onion, right? An onion has many layers. And when you want to defend and protect yourself, you need to deploy many layers of protection. And so when it comes to security, we're talking about the firewall on the server, you're talking about the antivirus on your desktop, you're talking about the storage scanning. Well, when it comes to detecting violations across your comms, you want a similar based approach, right? You want to use AI as but one of many tools I believe firms should be deploying. You don't want to be relying solely on AI. The other piece is when you are relying on AI, as Anna said, you don't want it to be black box, right? You need to have a level of understanding of what the AI is doing. I don't think any regulator out there expects you to be able to, backtrace and explain all of the math behind the algorithms that the AI is utilizing. But you need, as a firm, to be able to understand why a particular hit is being generated for an alert. You need to be able to understand what factors of the comms are being evaluated by the AI to come up with the outcomes that it's providing. If you can't understand those concepts at a high level, then I think you're in trouble because essentially you're dealing with a black box.
Well, AI is certainly the hot topic and transitions us into the next section here. So I don't want to steal too much of that thunder. I do want to set us up a little bit because we talked about the pressures, we talked about the structural change that we're seeing and feeling. Now I want to look at where institutions are starting to pull ahead. There, as we've talked about, explainable AI, many of them are using that. They're using AI and they're able to explain it. But more than that, they're also leveraging the power of automation to reduce noise and sharpen their focus. They're also designing architectures that deliver regulatory confidence. And we talked a little bit about that, as well as control, especially in a fragmented environment. And increasingly, data governance isn't just simply about hygiene, it's a trust strategy. So these aren't dramatic reinventions, of course, but they are disciplined decisions that we are being asked to face that will help us bring hopefully clarity, resilience, even some long-term advantage to the fold here. And Anna, I do want to look back into the research a bit. Where are you seeing institutions move beyond reactive compliance into a more deliberate program design?
Well, on the AI deserves a little bit more of a chat.
Yes.
On the communication surveillance side, you see some impressive moves using natural language processing and LLMs to actually produce alerts, like we've been talking about, and that can improve the targeting of the alerts dramatically, and it has been even fueling a bit of a rethink of how your teams are structured, maybe from the first pass of materials being done by a large offshore team, that some of this is nearshored to more expert people after it's been chugged through by an AI helper. I would contrast that pretty dramatically, though, with what's happening on the trade surveillance side, where there's been a total rejection of AI for the production of alerts, and instead a very deliberate decision to stay with deterministic, rules-based alert creation triggers. That's not to say that they're not making use of some pretty cool tech within trade surveillance. They are using your sort of tools to query their databases, and the analysts have a much better experience as a result. But to actually create the alerts, they're relying on something deterministic. If you go to the slide about with the Venn diagram for the vendors, I'd also say that there really are an extraordinary number of vendors in this market. But the leading financial institutions don't buy based on features alone. They're taking a very close look at security, the financial stability of their partners, the ability to exit their working with these vendors, one or the other, in case they need to, for any reason, data portability. And of course, there are some firms who are also trying to use some of these new technologies to build their own bespoke solutions. But there you have to also proceed with some pretty serious caution. One of the financial institutions I spoke with referenced a peer institution that had built their own solution, and for one of their models, they found out it hadn't been working for 14 years. That's a mistake. And execution risk, if you build your own, of course, is high. there's a risk no matter what you do. But there are some impressive surveillance programs around.
Speaking about execution, let's bring Chris in. Chris, what are some of the practical steps that you've seen surveillance teams taking to improve their efficiency and control clarity in terms of their compliance programs?
Right, in terms of AI, right, Shiloh?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this should definitely be a stepwise approach, right? You shouldn't just jump into the latest and greatest. I mean, you can if you want, but generally, firms are a bit more reluctant to change. And so implementing change in a way that shows demonstrable results very quickly is a great way to gain traction and introduce more of those types of features into the program. So generally, I always recommend to firms is to leverage AI to help identify and remove false positives from your review queues. That's an easy win. That's something that is easily reproducible by many of our clients and should definitely be where you start, right? After that, it's about going after the false negatives, right? And using technology like Anna indicates, LLMs and other natural language processing and other techniques to help identify things that may not have necessarily surfaced, leveraging an old lexicon-based approach, right? And so as you go from focusing on the reduction of false positives to the reduction of false negatives, you should be, one, seeing a smaller and smaller review queue, and two, finding a higher concentration of findings within that review queue over time. And that's definitely a direction that I think all firms need to be on today, especially given the regulatory expectations around AI. But it's fine if you're still in the first step, as long as you have a plan to progress to that second step. There's another area as well that I think is also equally as important, and that is the fact that our economy is incredibly intertwined, even more so on a global perspective. And so, how do you deal with alerts spanning multiple languages, right? And so, to be able to detect alerts in different languages, and more importantly, having a non-native speaker able to, at the very least, do that initial determination as to whether or not something needs further investigation is really key, right? You don't want to be having a Spanish review team and a French review team and a German review team for level one, level two, level three, right? Like you need to be able to kind of streamline things through a single team, even if they're based in English, have the intelligence to maybe translate the items or highlight potential violations in other languages so that they can better interpret what's going on. And if further escalation is then required, then maybe, yeah, sure, forward that along to a native speaker of that language. And I think that's another area where there is a lot of uh, benefit that is yet to be achieved by many firms that haven't kind of gone multi-language yet.
It sounds like there's plenty of opportunities, and that takes us into the next poll here. When you think about your organization, where do you see the biggest opportunity to get ahead? Is it in AI? Is it in governance? Maybe it's in efficiency of how you manage your different workflows. And while that poll is running here, let me ask you, there's so many things that we could be doing perhaps, but when we prioritize, what is like the smallest, most practical change that a compliance team could make, let's say in the next 6 to 12 months, that would materially improve their program? Where do you think the biggest bang can be achieved if when organizations are looking at their surveillance program of the next year?
I would follow Chris's protocol right there. That sounds very good.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I think that, I mean, those are the AI things you want to focus on. I think there's no doubt that you could leverage that. You can gain some wins. Thinking this a little bit higher level, right? I think the key word that compliance officers should be trying to permeate down across the team is the concept of coordination, right? We hear this all the time, right? I go to the FINRA conference led by the FINRA regulator, right? And they're all about, coordinating better with the regulator. That's going to help you be more proactive and better address upcoming concerns and new sweeps that we may have across the industry. They're completely right. I go to XLOD conferences, right? And they're all about coordinating across the three lines of defense, right? Totally makes sense. I think that there's a lot of room for coordination that can lead to immediate benefits for firms that aren't properly communicating across the three lines, right? And then the one that I've been sort of touting from my position as a vendor is coordination with the vendor. Are you regularly speaking to your technology vendors? Are you understanding what is coming down the pipe? Are you communicating what you need? Are you taking advantage of the newest features within the product? Right? I think if you kind of adopt those, you're going to be able to gain a lot of leverage, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of process as well.
All right, so let's move into our last and final section here. When we think about future forward, which we've already been talking a little bit about that, certainly the conversation does shift a little bit from tools to leadership. As you mentioned, let's up-level the conversation a bit. Resilience is certainly replacing reactivity as the benchmark. We all need to be able to adapt, not just simply respond. That's where the control factor comes into play. Success is now about proving trust, not just to regulators, but to boards, to our customers. And finally, strong leaders really embrace the measure of readiness. It's not just about the volume. It's about how ready are you? How many alerts are you able to process? Are you prepared in your programs? How prepared are you in your programs? So I do want to close by taking a look at what modern compliance leadership truly looks like. So Anna, as part of your study, you spoke with so many surveillance leaders. What distinguishes, or what did you find distinguishes the leaders, the institutions that are forward leaning here, that are genuinely leading in this moment? And what trends will shape leadership as we move through 2026 and beyond?
They're definitely using AI to improve triage and their pattern detection capabilities, but they're of course also keeping humans around to as sort of the ultimate judge of what's happening. Hallucinations are credibility failures. You really can't have rely on AI entirely yet. But leadership in the coming years, I would say, is probably defined by AI literacy, and for that to be successful, you absolutely should be working closely with the vendors that you work with, and have it be a two-way street. And when it comes to actually explaining to a regulator what the AI is doing, one of my interviewees said something that I thought was actually important, because a lot of surveillance teams that I've spoken with get hung up on the complexity of AI, and they're quite intimidated to get started at all. And this one interviewee said, not everyone on the team needs to be able to explain it. You need to have designated people who can explain it to the regulator. So as long as you have dotted that I appropriately, I think you can go ahead. But of course, you have to be careful not to overestimate the maturity of these technologies either.
And Chris, from a technology standpoint, how are the most effective teams really balancing that automation with the human oversight? And I know that you also spoke a little bit earlier about the three lines coordinating, as well as the value of coordination with the regulators and your vendor. So I'd love to unpack that one as well a little bit more as we think about where we should be prioritizing our compliance program roadmaps.
Yeah, there's a lot to that question, Trilo. I think I want to address something that Anna said because you know
Oh,
what,
okay.
Anna, I see this all the time, right? Um, Compliance teams traditionally um, are very good at what they do, right? They understand the industry, they understand the markets, they know what's happening sort of in the financial world. I think one of the challenges that I've seen as a vendor is the democratization of technology and the democratization of AI. It's increasingly become easy for these new features, these new technologies to become embedded in right inside surveillance workflows. And the challenge that exists at the moment is that a lot of the people using the surveillance tools aren't technology trained, right? And we're asking them to pick this up real quickly, understand it, start to use it. Um, I think the next era of compliance in general is going to have a greater aspect on technology training and understanding. And I think that needs to happen because there's a lot of work being done by myself as the vendor and other vendors that I compete with and cooperate with. We see this everywhere. There's a lot of uh, um, blind spots that exists when customers don't fully understand the technology that they're using, and you can't blame them. They haven't come up in an IT centric world. Some of them have, some of them haven't. And when you see those two different types of firms, the contracts are stark, and they understand this. They're picking it up, but it's a big challenge. So I really thought that was interesting that you kind of touched on that because I wasn't planning on talking about it, but you hit something there that's actually really real. So that was cool.
But what you just said also, what I came across frequently in my conversations was the recognition of the need to hire some talent with experience in AI, but maybe more interestingly, experience in project management. That term, just project management, even to manage these tools, and that was actually in short supply in compliance.
We did have a question, a hand raised by Chad. Chad, if you want to come off mute, we'd be happy to have you ask your question.
I
Oh,
believe I
okay.
promoted him to talk, but I don't know if he has to probably unmute.
Hey, Chad, are you able to unmute?
Oh, let's
Oh,
see.
accident.
Oh, he raised it by accident. Okay,
Oh,
sorry for putting you on the spot, but thank you for letting us know. All right, so as we wrap things up here today, I do want to certainly encourage folks that if some questions have surfaced here today or validated things that you've been feeling and seeing within your organization, the full financial services regulatory outlook 2025 to 2027 does go deeper. And you can access that report by going to our website or clicking on the link. And Nicole, I'll ask you maybe to just drop that link into the chat to make it a little bit easier to click on. We'll also forward it to you if you have not yet gotten it. But it does break down jurisdictional differences, AI expectations from regulators, technology trends, even the traits of the most resilient programs that Anna and her team had studied. And if you'd like to certainly continue a conversation about how these trends map to your own environment, we would love to connect with you.